Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, following the disastrous Alberton derailment and chemical spill, along with other recent derailments on the Montana Rail Link line, the FRA conducted a special investigation into MRL's operations. We also looked closely at vertical split heads, how they form in a rail and cause failure. We now continue with Part 6, Chapter 16. Rail wear. Epigraph. Nobody can measure the rail because it's busted up. MRL attorney Randy Cox. The heart of the plaintiff's case over liability was worn rail. MRL attorneys faced a rough track. The FRA concluded MRL had a rail wear problem that contributed to increased derailments. The original TSL report found rail wear contributed to the VSH in the Alberton derailment. The Keller memos proved MRL was concerned about increased tonnage, wear on curves, and the rash of derailments. And Cantu had written ball worn out for curve 155. MRL attorneys would adopt a three-prong approach. Exclude any evidence that didn't apply specifically to the failed rail, characterize their rail wear standards as not being standards, and try to make any issue related to rail wear simply go away by evoking the ultimate cowcatcher: federal preemption. Traffic and tonnage made rail wear an inexorable fact over time. Curve 155 endured 28 years' worth. A former BN worker, Roadmaster Augie Cantu, compared operations under MRL. There was more rail wear on Montana Rail Link after the lease because we hadn't replaced. Well, geez, there was more rail wear, he admitted in deposition. But 2 years after he wrote ball worn out for curve 155, Cantu equivocated. Cantu: that's not really initially what I meant. What I meant was it was getting close to the parameters set forth by MRL. I'm pretty sure that's what I meant. Plaintiffs: so to you, ball worn out means getting close to MRL's parameters? Cantu: yeah. Rail steel had become much harder since 1968, when curve 155 was laid and inferior A rail later eliminated. Expert Ronald Dunn noted modern rail was not only cleaner but also 30% stronger structurally, meaning it could withstand more wear. But MRL still had plenty of old rail left on its line, including in curve 155. Chief Engineer Richard Keller verified that some of the failed rail fragments were worn below MRL standards. A key argument of MRL was that the rail wear limits were guidelines, despite the terminology standard published in their own circulars. Rail worn beyond the standards didn't have to be relayed imminently or even dictate a slow order until it was relayed, they claimed, despite MRL's prompt response to do both in the wake of the FRA's 1996 rail assessment. Keller held his post since MRL's inception, coming from the Milwaukee Railroad. As for the timing of relay, Keller said, we try to replace the rail when it gets to those guidelines, so a curve may be scheduled for replacement before it gets to those guidelines. Plaintiffs: so the purpose of that is to get the rail relayed prior to it exceeding or going beyond the standards? Keller: that's correct. It may sometimes go over it. It may even be a little bit less. But Keller said the policy did not dictate to relay imminently when measures reach the guideline. It doesn't mean I take rail out of service if it gets beyond that, Keller said, adding that it also didn't mean such rail was unsafe or even potentially unsafe. Plaintiffs: what's the purpose of having the standard then? Keller: there is a huge safety factor in here. A height of 6.55 inches, 0.01 beneath MRL standard, didn't mean that suddenly the rail was unsafe. But Keller admitted the purpose of rail wear limits was that at some point reduced load-bearing capacity made rail unsafe. Plaintiff attorneys asked, when? For 132-pound rail, based on what Keller had read and seen, you could take maybe another half inch off that rail and still the rail would be structurally sound, he said. Half an inch more beyond the standard for both vertical and width wear? No, Keller said, in combination. But regardless, Keller said, rail worn below MRL standards did not violate MRL's policy, and it was safe to run trains over. Plaintiffs: so even half an inch below guidelines, still safe? Keller: well, what I'm saying is, we could still probably get a train over it. But my feeling is that this has a large factor of safety, he added. But plaintiffs wanted to discern between safely operating at regular speed and still probably getting a train over it. The latter operation brought to mind the last Milwaukee train limping to its death. Plaintiffs: so somewhere it becomes unsafe, between the standard and the half-inch? Keller: yes. In his deposition, Cantu was even more liberal in pushing rail. New rail was 7.125 inches tall. The MRL standard allowed wear to 6.56 inches. When asked if there was any point at which he would take a rail out of service upon measuring it below this vertical standard, Cantu flatly said no. At 6.5 inches? No. 6 inches? No. 5.5 inches? Since the ball height was 1 3/4 inches, Cantu allowed that we might be in the I-beam. It didn't seem so safe to run a load on a headless rail. Instead of ball worn out, it would be ball gone. The stem or web of a rail was only 11/16 inches wide, or 0.69 inches. Still, Cantu wouldn't admit to when unsafe measurements began. As for gauge wear on the ball, I run rail all the way up so the flange is striking the web, he said. With the inside arm of the T of the head worn clear off, Cantu thought it still safe. When asked if wear below both the vertical and width standards was safe, Cantu agreed with Keller and said, yeah. He added, if the rail is not showing any defects or problem areas, I would say it would still be safe at track speed. As far as his experience, the rail is still structurally sound. In his deposition, Cantu implied that MRL had more worn rail than he saw under BN because MRL deferred relaying, but such rail was still safe and not even a violation of MRL's internal policy, he claimed. Roadmaster Roger Babcock also testified that rail worn below MRL's limits did not mandate relay. You call it a standard, he said. I call it a guideline to where MRL considers replacing rail. But MRL Circular called it a standard, as did the railroad industry. Plaintiffs: now, do these guidelines, as you put it, purport to be track standards? Babcock: yes. Plaintiffs: so even though you say they're track standards, you consider them to be guidelines? Babcock: yes. When asked if it was safe to operate a train at track speed over rail worn below MRL standards, Babcock qualified his answer, as had Cantu. Yes, it's safe, depending on the rest of the conditions of the track. Unlike Cantu, he hesitated over whether it was safe to run on rail with the gauge face worn to the web, because he didn't recall seeing such severe wear before. It would depend on other factors, he said. In lockstep, MRL President William Brodsky said in deposition, our standards are guidelines for changing the rail. They're not federal regulations. They're company policy. Our guideline is a guideline that indicates it's a point at which we should be changing it out. But later, Brodsky rephrased, the standard is a guideline that says it's time to look at changing this. He agreed that Curve 155 was basically at a point that it was ready to be changed, he said. Yet he felt the curve was basically in compliance with our standard, he added. Regardless of whether the standards were intended to be relay triggers as conceived and written by BN and adopted by MRL, it was clearly the avowed practice of MRL not to treat them as such. Plaintiff expert Robert Rainey testified of the Alberton rail. I don't recall in my 25 years of railroading ever seeing the gauge side of a ball worn almost off, as in this case. I was amazed. In dispute of Keller's claim that either face could be worn another half-inch beyond MRL standard, and Cantu's claim that the gauge could be worn close to the web and be safe, plaintiff expert Dunn said such gauge wear rendered rail structurally unsound and subject to catastrophic failure. Dunn called the standard that a railroad set for relay a condemning limit, and after relay, such rail was generally scrapped or cascaded to lower uses. Plaintiff expert Edward Stanton found Cantu's remarks shocking and irresponsible about running rail until the flange struck the web, or with half the head worn off. Both experts thought Curve 155 should have been relayed in 1995. It was already clear what the FRA thought of rail meeting MRL standards for curve relay. Relay it this season and issue a slow order until then. MRL even complied after Alberton. Co-defendant BN adopted stricter standards in 1993-94, allowing less wear. BN's circular on worn rail on curves read, "Rail is to be transposed or released when the vertical limits are reached unless the chief engineer line maintainer authorizes a delay." But MRL and BN both argued that their standards were really guidelines, despite their circulars calling them standards and never guidelines. Larry Parker of BN said when wear exceeded their standard, he considered it for relay. When considering a worn curve for a fast track or emergency relay, short of rail failure, Parker also considered the rail defect history of a curve and the surface condition. Parker listed steps in considering rail for relay. The rail wear laser plot results, curve 155 showed excess of standards, a field verification, MRL verified the excess, taking more than 3 standard measurements in the curve, which MRL did not do, verifying the wear history and wear rate from previous reports, no documentation on record from MRL, reviewing defect history, curve 155 had a few plugs and one previous vertical split head, and inspecting for defects and surface conditions. Nothing was apparent on curve 155 excepting the later Sperry tape anomaly. All this information informed whether to fast-track a relay outside the regular season or defer it to the next year. An additional consideration was wear rate, how fast rail wear was wearing, a projection of wear based on ongoing and projected traffic. Relaying was supposed to be proactively planned. But of course, MRL's high traffic through 1995 and beyond had accelerated wear. By Keller's account in early 1996, MRL had not counted on it being sustained. But it was. The tonnage was known by MRL, and Keller's concern and the winter edition of more curves for relay, plus the FRA additions that MRL missed, proved that MRL either failed to anticipate the wear rate throughout 1995, or perhaps knew but struggled to keep up with needed relays, as Shutter suggested from his talk with MRL President Brodsky. The greater the traffic, the less time for repairs, even though the need for relay increased as wear increased. It was a worrisome cycle, perhaps only broken by the rash of derailments. It took the Bearmouth derailment at the very end of 1995 to stir up concern with Keller, and a whole year of increased tonnage had gone by. Though MRL could argue worn rail was still safe, the double standard in practice and argument concerning the timing of relay for curve 155 and the FRA discovered curves was evident. If the FRA had made their assessment in June of 1995, coinciding with the laser rail test, would curve 155 have been relayed that year? Presumably, yes. MRL adopted BN's 1994 Maintenance of Way operating rules. The BN circular called for slow orders on worn rail per se. Quote, when the head section of main track rail is worn below the limits, the curve is to be slow ordered until rail replaced. This rule implied recognition of decreased safety of rail exceeding the wear standard, at least at track speed. For rail with evidence of failure, regardless of wear, BN called for a slow order and immediate removal. In contradiction of the BN circular, Parker claimed rail wear alone did not dictate any speed restrictions, just as Babcock had said for MRL. But again, the FRA assessment on MRL resulted in curves being slow ordered because of wear. Why hadn't curve 155 been slow ordered as well? As always, it was important to note that the FRA did not regulate rail wear, including how it related to operating speed. A railroad's violations of its own standards wasn't necessarily an infraction of law. MRL attorney David Potter argued, rail wear limits are like putting gas in your gas tank when it's 1/4 full. There's a margin of safety of 2 or 3 years, he said. A more apt analogy to ignoring rail wear limits would be not adding gas when low and hoping you make your destination. Despite semantics, there had to be a point when one must prudently relay, even based on wear alone. If wear limits were based on structural engineering, that is, setting limits to avoid reaching a point of rail failure, that threshold was not clearly established by standards nor admitted to by MRL and BN in litigation. Obviously, such a point of wear existed, irrespective of rail defects, assuming development of a defect was not related to rail wear. And yet, the FRA chose not to regulate rail wear. It left it up to the railroads to set standards that BN and MRL defended as only being guidelines. But the purpose of retiring rail, of course, was safety. Otherwise, the rail would be indefinitely useful. Economy of use and safety limits met at some gray area. An old tire eventually blows. What amount of wear was unsafe? When did an aging asset become dangerous? An asset that must structurally support the greater asset of heavy, high-speed freight trains. Logically, economic use diminished or ended when the thing being utilized ceased to function as well or failed altogether. On a railroad, this equated to less safe or unsafe rail. As Keller stated, there may well be and should be a safety zone cushion before the point of imminent structural failure. But even the cushion implied increased risk and liability, and the point of failure could vary depending on other conditions of the rail, such as defects. That was the purpose of relay standards and slow orders, to reasonably avoid reaching that varying point of failure due to wear and fatigue. A comparison of published standards for MRL and BN revealed the less stringent standards of MRL. Transposing high rail to low rail on a curve was triggered when gauge face wear on the head fell within a quarter-inch range. MRL standards called for transposing rail on the high side of a curve when width of the rail had wear between 0.34 inches to 0.59 inches, whereas BN transposed rail at wear between 0.25 inches and 0.5 inches. Note that there was a 1/8 inch gap between gauge face transposing and relay standards. Presumably, rail measuring within that gap had been transposed. Wear beyond that point triggered outright relay of the rail, as did the separate standard for vertical wear. MRL standards called for rail relay when width of the rail had worn 0.72 inches, while BN relayed when width was worn 0.63 inches. On rail height, MRL relayed at height wear of 0.56 inches, while BN relayed at wear of 0.5 inches. BN was more conservative on wear. Both BN and MRL policies stated to relay, not consider to relay. A straightforward interpretation was that if rail was found to meet the standard, then relay it, and with rail still within standards, plan to relay based on anticipation of when the rail would exceed the standards. MRL's open-ended interpretation suggested that no known level of wear demanded relay, and this certainly was not the case. Rail wear eventually led to structural failure. MRL could argue about the safety of rail beyond their standards, but clearly the standards were designed to trigger relay. Dunn quoted the MRL circular on curve relay policy. Rail wear must be projected to what it would be in the anticipated date of relay. Dunn said, that is saying to anticipate the wear so that the rail is, in fact, changed out before it reaches these condemning limits. Dunn's interpretation was even stricter than interpreting standards as a trigger, calling for relay prior to reaching the standard. In the Mayo case, Magistrate Leif Erikson denied MRL's motion to exclude plaintiffs from mentioning that rail wear limits were condemning limits. Despite MRL employees testifying that wear alone did not dictate relay, even when it exceeded MRL standards, sources relied upon in the rail industry suggested otherwise. From Dr. William Hay's authoritative railroad engineering book, called The Bible of the Railroad Industry, he wrote, most rail removed from service in the U.S. is because of excessive wear, not from found defects. Removal of worn rail was done to avoid increasing the risk of fracture, of loss of gauge control, and risk from excessive dynamic loads, likely to result from further wear. Relatively small decreases in section modulus can result in very large increase in crack growth, he said. In short, wear could generate serious defects, as well as allow defects to express themselves. Wear could lead to broken rails. Some railroads had single-dimension standards like MRLs. If any single-dimension standard of gauge face or vertical wear was exceeded, the rail was relayed. Other railroads had a combined dimension limit, a more modern approach. The amount of vertical wear that triggered relay was dependent on the amount of gauge face wear, and vice versa. In theory, as well as practice, MRL could be within a tiny fraction of reaching their standard for both vertical and gauge face wear and not have exceeded their standards until either one crossed the line. The same measurements under a combined standard would trigger relay much earlier. Combined limits considered the overall structural integrity of remaining material. Likewise, the Railroad Engineering book recommended that vertical wear or its equivalent area in terms of combined vertical and side wear of 3/4 of an inch in 132-pound rail can be taken as acceptable wear to trigger condemning the rail. MRL's wear limits allowed width wear of 0.719 and vertical wear of 0.562 inches separately. Combined, MRL's wear limits added up to 1.28 inches of wear, easily surpassing William Hayes' 0.75 inches combined wear recommendation. Another measure of wear was total percentage loss of railhead area. MRL standards allowed 35.3% reduction of the head. BN allowed 30.5%. In Ronald Dunn's examination of 11 cross sections of Curve 155 rail, he found wear reduction of up to 41% of the original head. On its face, a combination standard suggested that if standards weren't triggers in practice, they were meant to be by design, belying any notion of a supposed open-ended guideline. Another way to consider rail viability was measuring its years of service in cumulative tonnage. Over years of bearing weight, rail began to fatigue and accumulate defects, regardless of wear, and was said to have a fatigue life. The point of replacement could be defined as the cumulative millions of gross tons, or in defects per mile per year, 1.25 often being the standard, or both. In theory, rail could reach the end of its fatigue life well before it reached wear limits, but this was more of an issue with tangent track, because curve track normally reached wear limits before it reached fatigue life limits. MRL's relay policy did not consider fatigue life. Detected defects on the entire MRL line had risen from 65 in 1987 to over 1,000 in 1996, though some of this increase reflected more internal inspections by Sperry Rail. Still, the entire 937-mile line of MRL approached an average 1.25 defects per mile standard. In 1973, BN sponsored a study by William Hayes, author of the Railroad Bible, who estimated that the rail life for 132-pound rail adjusted for a 3-degree curve would be 503 million gross tons on the high rail, assuming proper lubing and grinding. MRL's Keller estimated the tonnage carried by Curve 155 at between 600 to 700 million gross tons since 1968. Plaintiffs pointed to 3 vertical split heads in 1968 rail within a half mile on Curve 155 since 1989 as proof of dying rail. Based on cited studies, Curve 155 had far exceeded its fatigue life. Finally, MRL's relay standards did not distinguish between curves versus tangent rail, but their standards for transposing rail acknowledged the significant differences in stress and wear on curves and high rail. Unlike tangent rail, the stresses on the two rail sides were not equal on a curve, though proper superelevation of the high rail attempted to adjust for the differences to some degree. Vertical head loss was the dominant wear on tangents and shallow curves. On curves 3 degrees and greater, gauge face wear also occurred from contact with wheel flanges. Rail wore faster on the high rail due to greater force and stress, so rail that had wear within about a 1/4 inch of the relay standard was swapped with the low rail or simply used to change out low rail depending on low rail wear. According to Hayes' Railroad Engineering book, on 3-degree curves, the vertical and gauge face rate of wear on the high rail was 1.65 to 9.88 times the low rail, probably depending on the superelevation, speed, and tonnage. The high life meant a shorter life. Under MRL standards, transposing rail was called for when the gauge face measured in a range of 2.625 inches to 2.375 inches. Rail height did not have a transposing standard. The standard was indisputably meant to be a trigger, not a guideline, because wear beyond 2.25 inches called for outright relay. Plaintiff lawyers never jumped on the fact of the close-ended standard for transposing rail. If rail exceeded limits for transposing, then there was no argument for not having transposed it, regardless of whether or not it was eventually put into the relay program. Transposing rail effectively was a relay off of a curve's high rail. When MRL discovered rail in curve 155 in 1995, measuring 2.44 inches, along with a laser rail profile off the chart, this should have immediately triggered transposing. Otherwise, standards for transposing meant virtually nothing. And this wasn't true. Their purpose was to get such worn rail off of the high rail. This appeared to be clear neglect by MRL, at least of their own standard. During the course of the Austin trial, it became clear that such neglect was a long-running practice, when evidence arose that parts of curve 155 had met the transposition standard as far back as 1991. But what mattered was the failed rail, the fragments that survived as evidence. Fragment N39 with a vertical split head measured 6.44 inches in height, 0.12 inches beyond MRL's relay limit. According to a Marty Rao field memo, he measured one fragment at a height of 6.22 inches, or 0.34 inch beyond the standard, the greatest vertical wear recorded for curve 155, and with a width of 2.44 inches. Notably, the combined wear equaled 1.43 inches for this piece, which Rao recorded as CHX3473A, allegedly the rail fragment with a vertical split head seen in Richard Keller's office. The measurement was never later verified by experts because the rail disappeared. This ghost rail was already gradually disappearing before the derailment. Despite these measurements, MRL attorneys claimed with a built-in safety margin in place, there were in fact years of safe life left in curve 155. Yet, the shattered curve was now quite dead. One person had died and many more had suffered for years. While plaintiffs made the case that MRL should have relayed curve 155 earlier and that wear played a role in the development of the vertical split head, they also argued the rail was inferior grade so-called A rail. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we consider how A rail might have contributed to the failed rail that caused the Alberton chemical spill, and how various stresses in combination with rail wear played a role. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.